thank you all for your support. Thank you so much. Hello everyone, this is QI Maple. It has been 6 whole months since I last made a player progression guide video, and that was in Chinese. So this time, I've put together an English version of the player progression guide for you all, while heavily optimizing and simplifying the previous progression framework. The content of this video is applicable to every player except Ultra Whales, and it has been verified by millions of players over an entire year, so you can follow it with complete confidence. Without further ado, let's get right into it. SwordxStaff has many different progression paths, but here I've selected the 2 most reliable and popular routes for everyone, along with additional adjustments and optimizations. The first progression route is the permanent power focuses. This route mainly uses legendary gear, selling all mythic shards and divine shards to maximize your profits, and then investing the earned Donium into relics and material realms to further boost your power. The second progression route is the combat focuses. The core gameplay here is to equip gear from new dungeons in advance to boost your power, allowing you to enter nightmare difficulty dungeons earlier than other players, gain divine shards, and increase your Donium revenue. Both routes have their pros and cons, so let's start with the first one. The biggest advantage of the first route is that you will have significantly higher Donium income compared to players choosing the second route. Depending on whether you use mythic or divine gear, a full gear set from a single dungeon can be worth 15,000 to 25,000 Donium. If you craft shards yourself every season, an average season with 7 dungeons will cost you anywhere from 100,000 to 170,000 Donium. This is precisely why the playstyle of wearing legendary gear for an entire season exists. If you invest this Donium into your permanent power, then the longer you play, the stronger your foundation becomes. This should be very easy to understand, right? Because all gear is essentially a consumable item. In the first few months of a server, when everyone is highly competitive, trading profits in the trading house are very high for everyone. As time goes on and players shift from spending competitions to casual progression, trading income drops for all players as overall market prices decrease. This logic is also straightforward. In almost any period, gear shards in nearly every server hit peak price within the first few days of a dungeon opening, namely 30 Donium for mythic shards and 50 Donium for divine shards, which is practically an eternal rule. Selling gear shards during this window becomes the primary source of income for most players. This is why the permanent power focuses strategy is so sustainable. As long as the second progression route exists, the permanent power focuses route will remain viable. At the same time, this strategy completely avoids investing in a fixed rerolling, which can be an absolute money pit. You can always find legendary gear from your daily cart claiming that has stats beneficial to your class. This route works even for heavy spenders. Even if you already have full ideal affixes, you can buy gear from older dungeons to get all affix stats at minimal cost. Older gear is always extremely cheap. Mythic shard prices for old gear often drop down to around 100 Donium, and complete pieces in the trading house can drop below 500 Luminium. Buying them with Donium costs around 30,000 Donium per season, leaving you with over 100,000 extra Donium. That's equivalent to gaining over 30,000 Donium in profit out of thin air every month, which is completely acceptable. The bigger a spender you are, the more your stats rely on your foundation. After each new dungeon update, the gap in power between old gear and new gear is actually not that large. Taking myself as an example, my gear from the current dungeon is only 30 million power higher than my gear from the previous dungeon. While that sounds like a lot, when compared to my total power of 1.6 billion, the power gap between 2 dungeon gear sets is less than 2%, which is practically negligible. Furthermore, buying mythic shards is fundamentally serving your affixes as part of your re-rolling expenses, rather than being for raw power gain. So, does this playstyle have drawbacks? Of course it does. For the vast majority of regular players, whenever a new dungeon opens, your biggest enemy is always your own level. The power of legendary gear obtained from your cart scales directly with your level. Only when you level up to a stage ending in 1 will the power of legendary gear from your cart and dungeons see a massive leap forward. For example, if you are level 100, The power provided by your legendary gear is almost certainly insufficient to carry you into higher dungeon difficulties. Only when you hit level 101 can you obtain legendary gear strong enough to enter higher difficulties. This means your entry time into Nightmare difficulty will almost certainly be later than players who chose the second route. Players on the second route can completely bypass this hard limitation imposed by levels. But the good news is that this exact downside turns this progression route from a free-to-play only strategy into a mainstream path viable for everyone, regardless of whether you spend money. Once you buy the monthly card with a 5% experience bonus, the fund that supplies temporal crystals, and level up the hero book for experience boosts, you'll find that you can consistently get legendary gear in the first 2 days of a new dungeon that has higher power than divine gear from the previous dungeon. After all, starting from Lunghaven, the cost to transfer gear affixes across seasons is fixed, and does not double just because you skipped a season in between. I admit that gear with god-tier affixes can last you until the game shuts down, but the gear investment for every new dungeon alongside the high transfer costs are significant expenses for regular players. For players on an extremely tight budget who worry about bad luck, fearing they'll waste tens of thousands of divine craft stones without landing decent affixes, this legendary gear route is essentially the best fit for you. Having reviewed nearly 1,000 accounts myself, I've seen plenty of casual players hoard divine craft stones for an entire season, only to end up with rerolled stats worse than basic legendary gear. Note that if your goal is to enter Nightmare difficulty dungeons, this progression route has a higher demand for material realms. For regular players without many experience bonus sources, legendary gear power is almost always lower than same period mythic or divine gear. If your goal is simply to raise your permanent power rather than clear Nightmare, the pressure on material realms will be much lower, though your Dawnium revenue will also decrease. You can choose for yourself whether you prefer entering high-pressure Nightmare or lower-pressure hard difficulty. Ultimately, my minimum expectation for all free-to-play players is to reach enough power to enter the current Nightmare difficulty before a new dungeon releases. If you choose me as your mentor, this is my baseline requirement for all free-to-play players. My own global server account isn't actually played very heavily. I log in once a day, or sometimes once every 2 days when work gets busy. So whenever I see comments accusing me of secret top-ups, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. I started playing SwordxStaff back in 2025, so I don't have the same level of raw passion as newer players anymore. Right now, I'm just playing my global account based on my own experience. I am not collaborating with the global official, nor do I have any secret official items. In fact, to save guide production time without lowering quality, I've posted almost all my previous video content as text guides inside my Discord, complete with dedicated discussion channels for each guide. That's right, the content of this video was actually finished inside my Discord last month. If you want the best guides at the earliest possible time, I highly recommend joining my Discord. Alright, now let's talk about the second progression route, the combat focuses. Its core gameplay is the exact opposite of the first route. This path requires players to acquire mythic or divine gear as fast as possible to unlock high difficulty dungeons. By bypassing level-based power restrictions, you can enter Nightmare difficulty early, sell divine shards, and maximize your trading house sales. For heavier spenders, they can easily enter Nightmare dungeons even without new dungeon gear. So if you are a high-tier spender, your main goal with this route is to inherit gear affixes. The biggest advantages of this path are the actual combat advantages brought by affix inheritance and early high power leads when new dungeons launch. Almost all mid to high spenders who reroll affixes are forced into this route, making it the most widely used playstyle currently. For mid to high spenders, the pros far outweigh the cons because they have enough luminium to buy needed affix gear in the trading house, and value packs prevent them from falling behind in power. Whenever a paying player buys a 700% value pack, a free-to-play player needs to spend 7 times the extra Dawnium to gain equivalent power gains, not to mention 2,000% value funds. You are probably familiar with this playstyle since most players play like this, entering Nightmare earlier than others, pushing further in stages and fantasy staircase floors than players in your spending bracket, and ranking higher in the arena. These are the core highlights of the game. Winning against a 1.2 million power legendary gear player using your 900k power account packed with affixes is where that true dopamine hit comes from. The biggest drawback of this progression route is its lower base power. As I mentioned earlier, even if you enter Nightmare earlier, the gear costs cannot be ignored. Spending 150,000 Donium per season, roughly equivalent to 20,000 Orowal badges, is enough for a free-to-play player to max out and awaken a blue relic in a kingdom. For free-to-play and low spenders using this route, the best compromise is to wear mythic gear while selling divine shards. So, which plan is better? Neither is inherently superior. As I said, even if you are a $10,000 whale, you can still use Route 1. Of course, shard prices depend on your server region. In some servers, trading prices stay high, while in others like mine, mythic shards can drop down to around 60 Donium. Many Chinese spenders use a hybrid approach, running Route 1 this season, then switching to Route 2 next season. I'm sure you're wondering, what materials should different routes sell? Can selling gems or Phantomon materials be considered a progression route? You're right. That does not count as a progression route. There are 3 reasons. First, selling gems, Phantomon materials, or dish ingredients is essentially resource conversion, turning unneeded resources into needed or more useful ones. Gear is different because every player needs gear. Taking Route 1 as an example, it is fundamentally investment or asset building, converting temporary resources into long-term advantages. Route 2 is a compound effect, sacrificing immediate resources for early high-difficulty clears and stage pushing, yielding continuous future gains. Second, prices for gems, Phantomon materials, and ingredients fluctuate over time and never follow gear's cyclical pattern of hitting price caps and bottoms in short spans. If you don't understand, look at this image. Gems in my Chinese server literally don't sell. Nobody buys them even at floor prices, and Phantomon materials sit unsold even when priced just 7 Donium above the 80 Donium minimum. That's why it cannot be a main progression route. It isn't sustainable. In other words, selling Phantomon items or gems is just sacrificing resource A for resource B. Many players don't sell gems, especially heavy spenders. Asking a knight player to sell wool for eggs is harder than climbing Babel Tower. They'd rather buy up all cheap market eggs and wool for themselves. This leads to the third reason. These methods cannot be applied by all player types. Whether free-to-play players should buy these resources comes down to personal choice. Shards fluctuate up and down in value, but other resources don't, because selling other resources generally loses you 20% to 30% in tax revenue. What you convert Donium into depends on what you need, as nobody mandates investing solely in relics. Even on my free-to-play account, I use Donium to buy market eggs and pull skills. Pulling relics simply ensures players keep up with seasonal pacing. I remember seeing many people claim that investing in material realms is a progression method. You've probably heard of buying tons of material realms with Donium instead of boosting permanent power. I used to think that was a progression strategy too, but I no longer do. Investing in material realms isn't a progression strategy, it's a choice of how you want your current season experience to feel. No matter how many material realms you buy, it doesn't change your account's core strength. For example, whichever route you choose, a day will come when you can clear higher difficulties while buying very few material realms, simply because your base stats are higher. Take this weapon. Its base power is 5.76 million. But because high material realm purchases boosted gear level, a staff with 5.76 million base power gained an extra 195 million seasonal power, which is a 33 times inflation. Players who invest earned Donium into base stats will see their investments amplified infinitely in the future. The difference between the two routes is merely a matter of degree. Throwing all your base power investment into seasonal power forces you to start over every single season. If you aren't getting permanently stronger each season, it isn't real progression. So, should we pick one progression route and stick to it strictly? Of course not. This game is season-based, which means every season you are free to choose whichever plan you prefer. If you notice that after choosing the second progression path, your permanent power is a bit on the lower side, you can simply switch to the first progression plan next season. Likewise, if after using the first plan for a season, you feel your permanent power is high enough, you can try out the second plan. Choosing the first plan won't render your previous affixes useless, nor will picking the second plan without ideal affixes waste your high-tier gear. Players of any spending tier can freely choose between these two progression plans. You can pick either plan, whether you buy material realms only twice a day, or buy 6 or even 8 times daily. In essence, the number of material realm runs simply amplifies your advantage for the current season. All you need to do is leverage the advantage from material realms to manage your account more comfortably. There is no concept of which one is better between these two progression paths. The fact that most players unconsciously use both already proves the viability of both routes. At the same time, they share a symbiotic relationship. Players on the second progression plan need the first plan's players and high-tier gear players to sell the latest shards, while paying players on the first plan need the low-priced shards salvaged from upgraded gear by the second plan's players. Perhaps these two progression paths sound familiar to you, because they are the optimal strategies that players have naturally iterated over time, and everyone has been using them unconsciously. I hope this video helps clear up some confusion. If I missed anything, feel free to point it out or share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget we have a dedicated Discord for strategy discussions. If you're worried your question won't get answered in the comments, asking in Discord is definitely your best bet. Also, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.